The day Grace Shepard buried her second husband, she made herself a promise so ironclad and final that she pressed it into her chest like a brand. She would never again let a man close enough to leave a mark. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was no place for soft hearts. Dust devils spun across the flatlands outside Redemption Creek like restless spirits that could find no peace. And Grace had decided she had far more in common with the cracked, sun-baked earth than with anything green and growing. She was 28 years old, the owner of the only working cattle ranch within 40 miles that had not been swallowed by drought or debt, and she had earned every callus on her hands, every line beside her eyes, every ounce of reputation she carried into town like armor. Her first husband, Thomas Shepard, had been a good man with a weak chest. He had coughed his way through 2 Arizona winters and given up on the third, leaving Grace with a deed to 300 acres, a herd of 42 cattle, and a grief that sat in her sternum like a stone. She had mourned him properly, worked through it the only way she knew, with her hands in the dirt and her boots in the stirrups before sunrise. She had not crumbled. She had not asked for help. She had pulled the ranch from the edge of failure by sheer, relentless will, and she had been proud of that. Her second husband, a man named Raymond Alcott, who had come through Redemption Creek with smooth words and a suit that was too clean for the territory, had not been a good man at all. He had seemed like salvation at first, a business mind, some Eastern money, a way of looking at Grace that made her feel seen. What he had actually been was a gambler, a liar, and a coward who had run up debts with men who did not forgive easily. And when those men had come collecting, Raymond Alcott had ridden north and never come back. He had left Grace with his debts, his enemies, and a humiliation so deep she could not speak of it without her jaw tightening. She had paid the debts. She had faced the men who came to her gate with hard eyes and harder demands, and she had not flinched. She had sold 12 cattle and 2 horses and paid every single penny Raymond had owed, and when it was done she had stood in her yard in the late afternoon sun and told herself that she was finished. Finished with depending on anyone. Finished with trusting words that came easy. Finished with the particular brand of foolishness that came when a woman let loneliness talk her into believing a man's promises. The walls she built after that were not dramatic. They were quiet and methodical. She was polite in town, even pleasant. She traded fairly at the general store run by old Ezra Fenn, tipped her hat to the sheriff, bought rounds for the ranch hands at the saloon when they had a good season. She was not cold, exactly. She was simply contained. Self-sufficient in a way that discouraged the kind of help that came with strings attached, and discouraged the kind of attention that came from men who saw a widow with land, and decided she was a problem they could solve. She had 2 ranch hands who had been with her since Thomas's time. Old Pete, who was 57 and walked with a limp from a horse's kick he'd taken in his 20s, was loyal and weathered, and never once looked at Grace as anything other than the boss who paid fair wages and kept her word. Tamaz, who was 22, and had come up from Sonora with nothing but a pair of strong arms and a serious face, worked harder than any man Grace had ever seen and spoke little, which she appreciated enormously. The 3 of them ran the Shepard Ranch through the spring of 1878 with something like quiet routine. The cattle were healthy, the fences held, the well ran clean. Grace had decided, without exactly saying it out loud, that she did not need anything more than this. The ranch was enough. The work was enough. The silence at the end of the day, when she sat on her porch with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and watched the stars appear one by one over the desert, was enough. She had raised enough walls to keep out a storm. She had not counted on Luke Hale. He appeared on a Tuesday in late April, which Grace would remember later because she had been trying to mend a section of north fence that kept pulling loose from its post, and she was in a fine fury about it, her hands dirty and her patience thin, when she heard the slow clop of a horse coming up the road that ran past her northern boundary. She straightened and looked. The man on the horse was lean but not skinny. the kind of lean that comes from a life spent in the saddle and working with the hands. He wore a battered hat that had seen too many suns, a plain canvas shirt, and trail-dusty trousers. He was riding a roan mare that moved with a tired, patient quality, and he had a bedroll strapped behind the saddle and a single rifle in the scabbard that Grace noted the way she noted all weapons cataloged and filed. He saw her at the fence and pulled the mare to a stop. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was unhurried. Not the kind of unhurried that was performing calmness, just genuinely measured, like a man who had decided some years ago that there was no great benefit to rushing words. "Afternoon," Grace said. She did not put down the fence pliers. "I'm heading toward Redemption Creek. Am I still on the right road?" "You are. Another 2 miles, you'll hit the town road." He nodded, looking at the fence section she had been wrestling with. He did not offer to help. He did not say anything helpful and unsolicited about fence posts or wire gauge. He just looked at it the way a man looks at a problem he recognizes, and then he looked back at her. "Obliged," he said, and he rode on. Grace watched him go for a moment longer than was necessary, then turned back to the fence. She told herself it was because she was trying to remember if she had seen that roan mare before. She had not. She found out his name 2 days later when she rode into Redemption Creek for supplies. Ezra Fenn mentioned it with the casual ease of a man who had spent 40 years gathering and distributing information at his general store counter. "New man in town," Ezra said, wrapping her flower in paper. "Came in Tuesday. Name's Luke Hale. From up Texas way, I gather, though he doesn't say much about it. Took a room at the boarding house. Looking for work, seems like." "What kind of work?" Grace asked, because she was practical enough to file information that might be relevant. "Ranch work, seems like. He went and spoke to Caldwell over at the Double Bar, but Caldwell's not hiring. Went to the Mercer boys too, same story. Drought hit them harder than it hit you, seems." Grace said nothing to that. "Good hands are rare," Ezra added, which Grace understood to be a gentle suggestion dressed as a neutral observation. Ezra was fond of those. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, in a tone that suggested she would not. She saw Luke Hale again in the street outside the hardware store, where he was talking to Sheriff Walt Briggs with the unhurried quality she had noticed at the fence. He had cleaned up somewhat, the trail dust was gone, and he had a freshly pressed look to his shirt, but the battered hat was the same, and so was the quality of stillness he carried. Not lazy stillness, alert stillness. The kind that belongs to men who have spent time in difficult places and learned to be very quiet about what they were watching. He saw her. He nodded once, the same simple acknowledgement he had offered at the fence. She returned it and kept walking. She told herself she did not think about him after that. She did think about him once 2 nights later, when a storm came rolling in from the west and rattled her roof, and she lay in her bed listening to the thunder and wondered, briefly and without any particular conclusion, where a man stayed in a boarding house bed during a storm like this. Then she stopped wondering and went asleep. The following Monday, she rode back into town because one of the mare's shoes had thrown in Redemption Creek's blacksmith, a man named Dutch Garner who was built like a stone chimney, was the only option within reasonable distance. Dutch's livery was busy, 2 wagons ahead of her, and 1 horse being Rashad that was dancing and making everyone's morning difficult. Grace tied her mare to the post outside and sat on the bench along the livery wall to wait, because there was no use in anything else. Luke Hale came in 20 minutes later, leading his roan, who had also thrown a shoe. He looked at the line of waiting horses and then at the bench where Grace sat. He took the spot at the far end of the bench without any comment or performance about it and sat down, his hat on his knee. They sat in silence for a full 5 minutes, which Grace found oddly comfortable. "Fence post still giving you trouble?" he asked, without looking at her, his gaze out on the livery yard. She glanced at him. "Fixed it." "Good." Another silence. Dutch was making progress on the dancing horse. "You're the Shepard widow," Luke said. It was not a question. Just a fact he was stating. The way a man states the name of a river when he is orienting himself to a landscape. "I'm Grace Shepard," she said, with a slight emphasis on the first part that was not aggressive but was very clear about where she stood on the framing. If he heard the distinction, he absorbed it without reaction. "Luke Hale," he said. "I know," she said. "Ezra talks. Does everyone talk in Redemption Creek? It's a small town. The talking is proportional to the lack of other entertainment." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but carried something of humor in it. Grace looked at her hands. "You looking for work still?" she asked. She did not know exactly why she asked. She thought perhaps it was the practical consideration of needing help that old Pete's aging knees would not be able to give for much longer, and Tamaz could not carry the full ranch alone. "Still looking," he said. "I might have work. It would be temporary to start. I don't take on hands full time until I know they're worth it." He looked at her then, not with eagerness or relief or any of the things she expected, which were the things Raymond had always performed when an opportunity arose. He just looked at her with a level, patient regard. "What would the terms be?" he asked. She told him. Fair pay, board in the bunkhouse, 3 meals, and the understanding that she ran the ranch her way and did not negotiate on that point. "That's fair," he said. "You haven't said yes." "I was going to," he said. "I just wanted to hear all of it first." She almost smiled. She did not, but it was close. He started work at the Shepard ranch on Wednesday of that week. He showed up at dawn with his bedroll and his rifle and his quiet roan mare, and Grace showed him the bunkhouse and the layout of the property with the efficiency of a woman who had given this tour twice before and intended it to be entirely transactional. Old Pete watched Luke with the cautious, measuring look of a man who had seen hired hands come and go for 30 years and had strong opinions about which ones would stay and which ones would be trouble. After the first day, Pete found Grace in the kitchen after supper and said, simply, "He works clean," which from Pete was the highest possible praise. Tamaz said nothing about Luke Hale for 4 days. Then, on the Saturday of that first week, he came to Grace while she was going over the ledger at the kitchen table and said, "He knows cattle. He sees things before they are problems." And then Tamaz went back to the bunkhouse. Grace noted both reviews in the same way she noted the fence posts and the water levels, as practical information, filed where it belonged. What she did not file, because she was not entirely sure what category it belonged in, was the way Luke worked. She had employed men who worked hard because they were being watched. She had employed men who worked hard because they were desperate. She had known men who worked hard out of pride, and men who worked hard out of fury, and men who worked hard out of some restless energy that could not be still. Luke Hale worked hard in none of these ways. He worked with a quiet, complete attention that seemed to have nothing to do with being observed or rewarded. He was simply present, fully present, in the way that made the work better than it needed to be. He restrung the north fence section that had been giving Grace trouble, not just the posts she had mended, but the 2 on either side that were beginning to show stress. He did not announce this or make a point of it. She noticed it when she rode the fence line on Thursday afternoon and found the work done cleanly and without any flourish. She did not thank him that evening. She thought about it and decided that gratitude for work within the scope of the agreed employment was unnecessary. But she poured an extra half cup of coffee when she brought the morning pot to the bunkhouse porch on Friday, and she set it on the rail near where Luke was already sitting with his own cup, watching the sunrise paint the desert in orange and red. He looked at the extra cup and then at her. "The fence on the north line," she said. "It was going to give by summer," he said. "I know." He picked up the extra cup. She went back inside. This became a kind of language between them, and Grace recognized it as such without quite naming it. Practical exchanges. Observations about the cattle and the land. Information offered cleanly and received cleanly, without the weight of expectation or the slipperiness of charm. He did not compliment her hair or her cooking or her handling of the ranch. He did not look at her with the particular hunger that some men carried, the kind that made her feel like a problem to be acquired rather than a person to be known. He looked at her the way he looked at the land, with attention and respect. She found this deeply suspicious at first. She had been hurt in enough ways to know that some men built trust slowly on purpose, laying the groundwork for something they intended to claim later. She watched for this in Luke with the vigilance of a woman who had been fooled once and did not intend to be fooled again. She watched for the moment when the patience would curdle into pressure, when the quiet would become the kind of quiet that demanded acknowledgement, when he would do something that required her to feel grateful in a way she could not simply repay with an extra cup of coffee. The weeks went by. May came in hot and dry the way Arizona May always did, with a wind that scoured the land and made the cattle restless. Grace drove herself hard during the dry weeks, up before sunrise and out in the pastures until the light went, checking water levels and moving the herd toward the eastern grazing where the creek still ran. Luke worked beside her without complaint or commentary, and when the creek level dropped by 4 inches in 1 week, it was Luke who rode the upstream line and found the debris dam that had been reducing the flow, and cleared it on a Saturday morning without asking permission, because it was obviously the right thing to do and did not require discussion. She found the creek running fuller by afternoon and knew without being told. She rode out to the eastern fence and sat her horse and felt something unfamiliar in her chest, not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. Something more like the cautious, unsettled recognition that the walls she had built were functioning correctly, but that something on the outside of them was not, as she had expected, trying to breach them. Something was simply sitting, patient, present. She rode back to the ranch and said nothing about it. In June, a situation arose that forced a different kind of contact. One of the young cattle, a steer that Tomás had named Diablo for his ornery temperament, got himself tangled in a ravine on the eastern edge of the property, in a way that was going to end very badly without help. Tomás had found him and ridden back for assistance, and Grace and Luke rode out together for the first time, which meant that, for the better part of an hour, they were working within arm's reach of each other, managing a frightened and angry animal in a tight space where there was no room for distance or formality. It was hot and dirty, and at one point Grace slipped on the loose rock of the ravine wall and Luke caught her arm without thinking, both of them going still for a single breath, and then she found her footing, and he released her arm and they went back to work as if it had not happened. But the warmth of his hand on her arm remained for a moment longer than it should have, and Grace noticed it with the careful noticing of a woman who was keeping very close inventory. They got Diablo out. He was scratched and furious and tried to kick Luke twice on the way back, which Luke bore with patience. Tomás led the steer back toward the barn and Grace and Luke rode side by side in the late afternoon silence for perhaps 10 minutes before she said, "You've done this before. Gotten kicked by cattle, worked a ravine rescue." "Several times," he said. "There was a season in Texas where half our herd thought ravines were scenic destinations." It was the most he had said about Texas. She did not push it, but she asked, "How long were you in Texas?" "Most of my life up until 2 years ago," he said, a pause. "It stopped being home." She understood the specific weight of those words, the way a place could stop being home not because the geography changed, but because everything that had made it home was gone. She did not say this out loud, but she understood it, and she thought perhaps he knew she understood it, because he looked at her for a moment with something that was neither performance nor expectation, just recognition. "What was it?" she asked, because the question came before she could hold it back. "My family's ranch," he said. "My father died. My brother and I couldn't agree on anything. He bought me out and I took the money and rode west." Another pause. "It was the right thing, doesn't mean it was easy." "No," Grace said. "The right things rarely are." He looked at her again, and this time the look lasted a beat longer. She turned her eyes back toward the ranch in the distance and kept her face arranged in its usual composure. But something had shifted, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in weather before the clouds have gathered, a pressure difference, a quality of the air. July brought a problem she had not anticipated. 3 men rode onto her property on a Wednesday evening, an hour before sundown. Grace was on the porch. She recognized one of them, a man named Cord Webb, which was a name she had not heard in a year and a half and had hoped never to hear again. Cord Webb had been one of the men Raymond had owed money to specifically, the most dangerous of them, a small-time land speculator with a habit of intimidating people into deals they did not want to make. Grace had paid Raymond's debt to Cord Webb, every penny of it, and she had a receipt folded in her deed box to prove it. She stood up when they rode into the yard. Old Pete appeared in the barn doorway and Tamaz materialized from the direction of the pasture, both of them reading the arrival the way experienced ranch people read weather quickly and accurately. Luke came from the south paddock on foot, his hat pushed back, his hands unhurried. He positioned himself without any ceremony at a point slightly behind into Grace's left, close enough to be present, far enough to make it clear that he was not speaking for her. Cord Webb tipped his hat with the oily courtesy of a man who enjoyed the theater of politeness before delivering a threat. "Miss Shepard," he said. "Been a while." "Mrs. Shepard," she said. "And yes, it has. I paid your debt. I have the receipt." "Now see, that's an interesting thing," Cord Webb said, his eyes moving around the yard with the inventory-taking quality of a man who had decided he wanted something. "That debt, yes. But Raymond Alcott left some other obligations I've been sorting through. Turns out there's a question of a handshake agreement between him and me regarding the eastern grazing rights on this property." Grace felt the cold clarity of a woman who has been here before, the particular chill of a man manufacturing a claim. "There is no such agreement," she said. "This property was in my name before Raymond Alcott entered it and remains in my name with no encumbrances. You are welcome to ride to Redemption Creek and speak to Judge Harlan, who holds copies of the deed." Cord Webb's expression did not change, which meant it was a performance of calm, not the real thing. "I'm not saying you're wrong necessarily. I'm saying there's some discussion to be had." "There isn't," Grace said. "I am asking you to leave my property." There was a long moment where the three men sat their horses and nobody moved. Grace did not move. Old Pete did not move. Tamaz did not move. Luke did not move. Luke's stillness was different from the others. It was the stillness of a man who had arrived at a decision and was simply waiting to see if the decision would be necessary. He was not threatening. He was not performing. He was simply there in the way a stone wall is there, without drama and without doubt. Cord Webb's eyes moved to Luke. He took him in and then looked back at Grace. "We'll be in contact," he said. "Through Judge Harlan," Grace said. "If you have a lawful claim, pursue it lawfully. If you ride onto my property again without invitation, I will treat it as a trespass." They rode out. Grace stood very still until the sound of the horses faded. Then she turned to Luke, who had not moved, and said, "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," he said. "You were there," she said, and then walked back inside because she did not want him to see how hard her hands were shaking. She did not shake from fear. She shook from the specific, furious grief of having Raymond Alcott's damage follow her still, reaching back from wherever he had gone and leaving its prints on her life like mud on a clean floor. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and breathed until the shaking stopped. There was a knock at the door. She said, "Come in," expecting Pete. It was Luke. He came in and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of her, the way she had set the extra cup on the bunkhouse rail in May. He sat down across the table without being invited and without apology, and he folded his hands on the table and said, "Tell me about Cord Webb." She told him. Not because she owed it to him, and not because she was particularly inclined to share the humiliation of the Raymond Alcott chapter of her life, but because the situation had made sharing it a practical necessity. She gave him the facts in the same clipped, efficient way she gave anyone facts: Raymond's debts, the men who had come for payment, the receipt she held for Cord Webb's specific portion. She told him that Webb was the kind of man who did not actually believe he had a claim but was hoping intimidation would create one. Luke listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, he said, "You should make certain, Harlan has a copy of that receipt, not just the deed." "I will," she said. She had already been thinking this. "And someone should know if Webb comes back," he said. "Not because you can't handle it, because there's no sense in being alone in it if you don't have to be." Grace looked at him across the table. She looked at him for a moment too long in the way she had been carefully avoiding, and she felt something in the architecture of her careful management creak under a weight she had not expected. "Why are you still here?" she asked. It came out more plainly than she intended, not rude, but stripped of the social padding that usually dressed such questions. "Not tonight. In general, you could have found other work. Caldwell's been hiring since May." Luke met her eyes and did not look away. "The work is good here," he said. "Caldwell pays more. Money's not the only measure of good," he said. And then, before she could respond to that, he stood up and said, "I'll check the perimeter before dark," and walked out, taking his cup with him. Grace sat with her coffee going cold and felt the crack in the architecture spreading. She rode into Redemption Creek the next morning and delivered a copy of the receipt to Judge Harlan, who was a serious, dry-humored man in his 60s with little tolerance for manufactured land disputes. He looked at the receipt and the deed together and said, "Cord Webb tries to bring this as a claim. I'll throw it out before he finishes his first sentence. But I'll put a note in the file." Grace thanked him and rode home feeling less like the shaking woman of the previous evening and more like herself. She told Luke what the judge had said when she got back. She told him because he had asked to be told, and she had decided quietly, without announcement, that it was not weakness to tell a reliable person a piece of relevant information. It was simply practical. August came in with a killing heat that pressed down on the territory like a hand. The cattle drank twice their usual amount, and Grace spent long, hot hours managing their range and water access, coming in at the end of each day with the sun-baked, ground-down quality of a woman who had been working at the very edge of her reserves. The ranch hands were the same. Even Tamaz, who never complained, moved with a visible heaviness by evening. On the first Saturday of August, which was the kind of day where the air itself seemed to throb with heat, a water trough in the south pasture cracked along its base and began losing water at a rate that would make it useless by morning. It was discovered at 3 in the afternoon and required immediate repair, a patch of pitch and iron sheeting that could hold until a proper replacement could be arranged. Grace was already dirty and hot and had been in the saddle since 5 in the morning. She pulled off her gloves and knelt beside the trough to assess the damage and was calculating the repair when Luke appeared beside her with the materials from the barn. He had already looked at the trough earlier in the day and brought what was needed, which meant he had been watching for it, which meant he was thinking about the ranch the way a man thinks about a thing he has a stake in. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. They worked on the trough together for the better part of an hour in the brutal heat, side by side in the dust, and at one point Grace sat back on her heels to catch her breath and found that Luke was already handing her the water canteen from where it hung on the fence post, without a word, just extending it to her in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has simply noticed a need. She took it and drank and handed it back and went back to work, and the whole thing took perhaps 3 seconds and was entirely unremarkable, and Grace felt it in her chest like a struck match. That evening, when the trough was patched and the heat had softened toward the slightly more bearable heat of an Arizona evening, Grace sat on the porch and Luke came and sat in the other chair. There were 2 chairs on the porch, a fact she had never quite examined before now, and they were quiet for a long while, listening to the desert sounds settle into their night arrangements. "You grew up on a ranch?" she asked. "Born on one," he said. "Outside of Amarillo. My father built it from nothing. Good man. Worked himself into the ground." A pause. "I miss him more than I miss the land, I think, which is saying something because I miss the land considerably." "How long ago?" 3 years. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your husband, Thomas." He said the name carefully, the way people say names of the dead when they are not certain they have the right to use them. "Ezra told me it was a few years ago." 4 years, she said. And then, because it was the desert and the dark and she was tired enough that her usual careful management was less sharp than it usually was, he was a good man. He didn't deserve what the territory did to him. No, Luke said. The good ones rarely get what they deserve in terms of time. Grace looked out at the stars, which were very close and very many in the way they only are in the desert, where there is nothing between you and the sky. The second one, she said. She had not intended to say this. Raymond, you've probably heard the outline of it. Some, he said, not pressing, just present. I made a mistake, she said. I was lonely and I mistook smoothness for goodness. I won't make that mistake again. She said it plainly with no particular bitterness because she had processed the bitterness long ago, and what remained was simply a clear-eyed accounting of a lesson learned. Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The men who are actually good are rarely smooth." She looked at him. He was looking at the stars, his profile steady in the low light from the open door behind them. There was nothing in the way he said it that was self-referential or strategic. It was simply an observation, stated and left to sit wherever it landed. She thought it landed somewhere she was not ready to examine. She said goodnight and went inside, and she lay in her bed and listened to the August night and felt the crack in the architecture widening with the slow, inevitable progress of water finding its way through stone. September brought a development that changed the geometry of things. Old Pete's knees gave out on a Tuesday, not dramatically, not in a fall or an accident, just in the quiet, sad way that bodies make their last arguments against the work they can no longer do. The doctor in Redemption Creek told Pete that he needed rest, real rest, for at least 6 weeks, and that after that he could perhaps do lighter work, but the heavy ranch labor was behind him. Pete took this diagnosis with the philosophically resignation of a man who had seen this day coming and had made his peace with the distance before it arrived. He told Grace he was sorry, and she told him not to be sorry, and she made arrangements for him to stay in the bunkhouse and take his meals and rest without any pressure to work, for as long as he needed. "You're going to need another pair of hands," Pete told her, from his bunk where he was already looking better for the rest. "I know you know that." "I know," she said. "Luke's good," Pete said. "I've worked with a lot of men in my time. He's one of the good ones." Grace said, "I know that too." Pete looked at her with the calm, knowing look of a man who had watched her for the better part of 5 years and had his own set of accountings. "You know," he said, "sometimes a wall keeps out the bad weather, and sometimes it just keeps out the light." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "You rest," she said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. She hired a second new hand, a young man named Felix who had come into town with good references from a ranch up north, and whom Tomas vouched for as a hard worker. Felix was 20 years old and cheerful in a way that was slightly exhausting but entirely good-natured, and he threw himself into the work with the enthusiasm of someone who was glad to have it. This brought her workforce back to something functional, but the shifting of it had rearranged the daily rhythms in a way that meant Grace and Luke were more often paired on the larger tasks: the fence riding, the herd moves, the water management. And the more time they spent in the practical collaboration of the ranch's daily demands, the more natural the rhythm of it became. The more it stopped feeling like an employer and employee and started feeling like something else that Grace did not want to name. In early October, they rode out to the far northern pasture to check on a section of fence that Felix had reported as damaged. It was a half-day ride and back, and they packed food and water for it because there was no point in being otherwise prepared. The morning was cool in the way early October brings cool to Arizona, still warm by the standards of most places, but with a quality of air that reminded Grace of the world beyond the desert's summer dominance. They found the fence and assessed it, and Luke set to work on the repair, while Grace rode the line north to check the rest of it, which was the most efficient division of the task. She came back to find the repair completed and Luke sitting on a flat rock near the horses with a piece of jerked beef, and the canteen, waiting with the patient quality she had long since stopped finding suspicious and had begun to find simply restful. Restful was the right word. There was something about his presence that had stopped feeling like something to manage and had started feeling like something to settle into. And this realization arrived so quietly that Grace was not sure when it had happened. She sat on a rock near enough for conversation and took the canteen he extended and ate the food she had brought for herself. And they were quiet in the comfortable way of two people who have spent enough time working together that silence has lost its awkwardness. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said without qualification. "Why haven't you pushed?" He looked at her. He knew what she meant. She could see that he knew. "Why would I push?" he said. "Most men would. Most men see a situation and decide it needs to be resolved on their schedule." He looked out over the northern pasture for a moment, at the dry grass moving in the small wind and the mountains blue-purple on the horizon. "I've rushed things before," he said. "In Texas. A woman I thought I loved. I was 23 and I thought that wanting something very much was the same as being ready for it. She was wiser than me and she said no, and I was an idiot about it for a while, and then I grew up enough to understand that she had been right." A pause. "I'm not 23 anymore." "How old are you?" 31, he said. "And you think patience is the answer?" He looked at her then directly, with the level regard she had come to know as his most honest expression. "I think you're a woman who has been handed good reasons not to trust easily and that those reasons are real. I think pushing would not earn trust. It would only make you prove something you've already decided." A pause. "I'm not trying to move a wall, Grace. I'm just here." The use of her name, her first name, for the first time without the professional formality of the ranch, landed with a different quality than she expected. Not presumptuous, not strategic, just her name in his voice, stated as a fact of recognition. She looked at him for a long moment, feeling the wall between them with a new awareness, not of its height, but of its weight. How heavy it was to keep standing. How much of her it required to maintain. "I know you're here," she said. And then, because she was Grace Shepard and she did not make declarations she did not mean, "I appreciate that." He nodded and looked back at the mountains, and they finished their food and rode home. And when they reached the ranch, as the late afternoon light went copper and long across the yard, he helped her unsaddle her mare and brought in the water for the evening without being asked, the same as always. And Grace stood in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her and felt the wall shift. Not fall, not crumble, shift, as walls do when the ground beneath them is changing. October deepened into its best self, which in the Arizona territory meant mornings that made you believe in the possibility of beauty and evenings that confirmed it. The cattle were healthy and the water levels were stable, and the eastern fence line held firm. Cord Webb had not returned, and a note from Judge Harlan confirmed that no claim had been filed, which Grace took to mean that Webb had enough remaining sense to understand that manufactured claims needed to be tested against someone less prepared than Grace, who was very prepared indeed. She found herself doing a thing she had not done in years. She found herself thinking about conversations before they happened, not scripting them, not rehearsing outcomes, but simply anticipating the particular quality of talking with Luke about a thing, the way he listened and responded without performance, the way an exchange with him left her feeling more known and less managed. This was new, and she did not entirely trust it, but she also, for the first time in a long time, did not immediately try to dismantle it. On a Friday evening in mid-October, the town of Redemption Creek held its autumn social at the community hall, which was a tradition that served the function of reminding people who their neighbors were before the isolation of winter compressed everyone into their own four walls. There was music, a fiddle player named Hank Greer and his wife on the accordion, which was not beautiful music but was enthusiastic music, which served the same purpose, and food brought from every household, and the kind of general sociability that a small western town generates when given the excuse. Grace went, because she always went, because the ranch's standing in the community was important and she was not so self-sufficient that she could afford to be thought of as antisocial. She wore the blue dress she saved for occasions, which was not fancy by Eastern standards, but was the best thing she owned, and which she had always privately thought suited her coloring. She braided her dark hair and pinned it up and rode into town on her bay mare with the usual composure. Luke was already there when she arrived, standing near the back wall with a cup of something, talking to Sheriff Walt Briggs and Felix, and a few other men she recognized from the neighboring ranches. He had cleaned up more thoroughly than she had seen him. His shirt was white and pressed, his hat was the same battered one but with a new cord, and he had shaved, which removed the habitual stubble and revealed a jawline that Grace noted with the involuntary attention of a woman whose walls were currently operating under increased structural stress. He saw her come in. Something moved in his expression, not the hungry inventory-taking of a man who has spotted a woman, but a simple brightness, the specific, unguarded brightening of a face that belongs to a person who is pleased to see someone and has not yet thought to conceal it. She crossed the room to where old Pete was sitting, because Pete had come for the first time since his injury and she wanted to say hello. She talked to Pete and to Ezra Fenn, and to a woman named Clara Briggs, the sheriff's wife, who was kind and intelligent, and had been one of the few women in Redemption Creek who had treated Grace's situation after Raymond with something other than either pity or scandal interest. And then Luke appeared at her elbow with the comfortable inevitability of something that had been moving toward her for a while. "Evening," he said. "Evening," she said. "You look very well," he said. It was simple and direct, and carried none of the practiced flattery she had learned to distrust. He said it the way he stated any fact cleanly, as a thing that was true. She felt warmth move across her face and was briefly furious about it. "Thank you," she said. Hank Greer and his wife struck up a reel, and the floor cleared somewhat for those who wanted to dance. Several couples moved to the center of the room. Grace watched them with the pleasant, uninvested appreciation of someone who enjoys a thing without feeling required to participate. "Do you dance?" Luke asked. She looked at him. "I do. Do you?" "Badly," he said, but with reasonable enthusiasm. She found herself smiling, a real smile, not the polite social smile she deployed with general efficiency, a real one with actual amusement in it. She thought she had not smiled that way at a man, at this kind of close range, in a very long time. "There's a case to be made," she said, "for enthusiasm over technique. Then perhaps you'll permit me to demonstrate the case." She looked at him for a moment, feeling the decision move through her. Then she set her cup on the table beside her and offered her hand. He took it. His hand was warm and firm and unpretentious, and when they moved to the floor and he placed his other hand at her waist, it was not presumptuous. It was careful, the way a man is careful with something he values. He had not lied about his dancing. He was genuinely not proficient, but he was present in it, paying attention to her movements in a way that compensated for his imprecision, following her lead when she was more certain and working with her when they were equal. They made it through the reel with dignity, if not elegance, and when the music stopped, she found that she was slightly breathless and that his hand was still at her waist, and that neither of them had stepped back yet. She stepped back, but she was still smiling. "You survived," she said. "Barely," he said. There was something in his eyes that had not been there before the dancing, or perhaps had been there for some time and she was only now letting herself look at it. Something warm and unguarded and quietly, steadily hopeful. She thought about old Pete's words. Sometimes a wall keeps out the bad weather, and sometimes it just keeps out the light. They danced one more time, a slower piece that Hank Greer played with actual tenderness, and this time Grace did not step back when it ended. She looked up at Luke from the short distance between them and thought, "This is not a smooth man. This is not a man who came with polished words and a pressed suit and promises that were really appetites in disguise. This is a man who fixed the fence before I asked and cleared the debris dam and sat on the bunkhouse porch at dawn and handed me the canteen in the heat without making a thing of it." She thought, I know the difference now. And this is different. She did not say any of this out loud. She said, "It's getting late, I should ride back before it's fully dark." He said, "I'll ride with you." Not presumptuously, just as a fact, she said, "All right." They rode back to the Shepard ranch in the full dark of an October night, with the stars very large and the desert very still, and at one point their horses walked close enough together that his knee briefly touched hers, and neither of them moved away from it. At the gate of the ranch, they stopped their horses. The yard was quiet. There was a lamp burning in the bunkhouse, which meant Felix was still awake, and the main house was dark. "Grace," he said. Just that, her name, in the way he had said it on the flat rock in the northern pasture. She looked at him in the starlight. He was not leaning toward her. He was not reaching for her. He was simply looking at her with that steady, undemanding hope, the way a man looks at a door he would very much like to be allowed through but has made his peace with the possibility that it might remain closed. And she thought, the wall is still there, I can feel it, and I have decided that I am more tired of maintaining it than I am afraid of what is on the other side. "Come for coffee in the morning," she said. "At the house, not the bunkhouse porch." He understood the distinction. She could see that he understood it. "All right," he said. She rode into the yard and put up her mare and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen with the lamp turned low and felt the wall change, not fall, not crumble, but open. A door in the wall that she had built herself and held closed with both hands for years, opening by one careful, deliberate inch. She slept better than she had in a long time. He came for coffee in the morning at the kitchen table, the way you do when someone has let you in from outside. He sat where he had sat the night of Cord Webb's visit, but it was entirely different this time. She made the coffee properly in the actual pot and not the functional pot she used for the bunkhouse batch, and she put out the good cups and the small jar of molasses, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and said, "This is good coffee." "I know," she said, and sat across from him, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. About the ranch, but also about other things, about the territory and the way it was changing as more settlers came, and the cattle industry shifted, and the old ways of doing things met the new. She told him about growing up in Missouri with a father who ran cattle and a mother who kept books, and how the books had been as important to her as the cattle, which had made her unusual in the kind of world she grew up in. He told her about Amarillo and the red dust and his father's stories about coming to Texas when it was still mostly wilderness, and the way that history sat in the land if you knew how to look for it. He told her about the injustice he had seen in his years in the territory, how the Apache people who had lived on this land long before the ranchers and the settlers and the land speculators had been pushed and cheated and displaced in ways that the law had permitted, but that decency could not excuse. He said this plainly, and without the defensiveness of a man who needs to be told he is right. He had watched it, and it troubled him, and he said so. Grace told him about the specific loneliness of being a woman running land in a world where women were expected to find a man to do it for them, and the way that loneliness had made her vulnerable to Raymond's particular appeal, and how she had turned that vulnerability into a kind of iron once it was done with her. She said this without self-pity, just as information, and he received it with the respect it deserved. By the time the coffee was gone, and the morning had moved toward midday, the thing between them had a new shape. It was not yet spoken into existence, but it was real as the land and the work and the daily fact of him, sitting across her kitchen table in the morning light with his hands around a cup she had made carefully because he was worth the care. He stood to go back to work, and she walked to the door with him, which was a small thing but was not the usual gesture. At the door he turned to her, and she looked up at him and thought, "Yes." "Grace," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, working out the words with the same care he gave everything. "I want you to know that whatever you decide, whatever this is or isn't, I am not going anywhere. I'm not here because I'm waiting for something. I'm here because being here on this ranch, working this land alongside you, is the best version of my life I've found." A pause. "I wanted to say that plainly," She looked at him for a long moment. She felt the door in the wall open another inch, and then another, until the light was coming through properly. "I know you're not going anywhere," she said. "I've been watching to make sure, and you're not." A pause of her own while she found the words. "I am not a woman who gives herself easily, and I am not going to stop being careful, and I am going to be difficult sometimes in ways that are not fair to you." "I know," he said. "And I am still very much decided that I am enough on my own." "You are absolutely enough on your own," he said without qualification. "But," she said, and felt the word change everything, "but I think you might be worth finding out about." Something happened in his face. It was not the performance of joy or the performance of triumph. It was simply real. A man whose quietly held hope had just been confirmed as something other than foolishness, and who felt that deeply and did not try to make it smaller. He reached up and very gently, with the same care he used for everything, tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face that had come loose in the morning wind. Just that. His hand warm against her cheek for a single breath. "I think so too," he said. She let out a breath she had apparently been holding for several months. And then they both went to work, because the ranch did not stop for sentiment, and because for both of them, work was part of how they loved things, and they were beginning to understand that about each other. November was different. Not different in the work, which was the same as always harder in places, as the season shifted and the cattle needed different management, and the fences needed winterizing against the cold nights that came even to the territory. But different in everything else. Different in the way the day began when Luke came to the house for coffee, which had become the established morning pattern without either of them making a decision about it. Different in the way evenings on the porch were no longer two people sharing a silence that was careful and managed, but two people sharing a silence that was full of comfort and something growing. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday evening in early November, and it was both exactly what she had expected and nothing like what she had braced for. She had expected that, when the moment came, it would require management, that she would feel herself tightening or retreating into the old practiced composure. Instead, she found that her hands moved to his arms without consultation, and that the composure she felt was not the guarded kind, but the entirely different and disarming kind that belongs to a woman who is exactly where she wants to be and knows it. He kissed her the same way he did everything, with complete attention and without hurry, and when he drew back he kept his forehead against hers for a moment and said nothing, and the nothing was right. "Well," she said, into the small, warm space between them. "Well," he agreed, which told her that the feeling was the same for him, which she had suspected but now knew. She pulled back enough to look at his face. In the lamplight from the open door he had the look of a man who had walked a long road and found himself somewhere worth being. She thought she probably looked similar, though she felt it more than she could see it. "I'd like to be clear about something," she said. "Please be," he said. "I am not going to be a woman who is managed or spoken for or decided about. If this is a thing between us, it is a thing between equals." "Yes," he said simply and completely. "And the ranch is mine. It will remain mine. I will make the decisions about it." "Yes," he said again, "and I will still be difficult sometimes." He smiled, the real smile, not the occasional one she had seen at moments of general humor, but the one that was specifically for her, the one that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there. "Grace, I have been sitting outside your walls since April. I am well acquainted with difficult, and I am still here." She looked at him, this man who had not tried to climb what she had built but had simply stayed, who had not demanded or manipulated or performed patience as a strategy, who had been genuinely, completely, unstrategically patient because he was a man who understood that good things require it. "Yes, you are," she said, and she kissed him again, which was her own kind of answer. December brought the ranch into its winter pattern and brought Grace and Luke into something that could only be called a courtship, though Grace said this word internally with some private amusement, because courtship suggested a kind of formal arrangement that did not quite capture the reality, which was two people who had been working beside each other for months and were now also sharing their hearts, which was messier and better and more real than anything formal. They told nobody and nobody was surprised. Old Pete said nothing, but looked at Grace with an expression of deep satisfaction when Luke brought the kitchen pot out to the bunkhouse one morning. Tamaz observed the situation with his characteristic quiet, and after due consideration, shook Luke's hand one afternoon without explanation, which Luke accepted with the same solemnity, and which seemed to settle everything between the two of them in the way that men sometimes manage such things without words. Felix, who was 20 and enthusiastic about everything, was delighted and said so repeatedly, until Tamaz gave him a look that suggested he might want to reduce his frequency. Clara Briggs, the sheriff's wife, who saw Grace in town and understood women's situations with more accuracy than most, took Grace's hand in the general store one afternoon and said, "You look well. Genuinely well. Not managed well, but the real kind." And Grace, who was not given to displays, squeezed her hand back and said, "I feel it." Christmas came and went with the ranch's version of celebration, a proper meal, a day off for the hands, and a small observance that Grace had always managed quietly, which had always before been a day she got through and was grateful to have behind her. This year it was the kind of day she did not want to hurry past. She made a meal that justified the kitchen's full capacity, and they ate together, her and Luke and Tamaz and Felix and Pete, who was moving better but still resting. And afterward Luke helped her clear the dishes, and they stood in the kitchen with the last of the daylight coming gold through the window, and he said, very quietly, "I love you." She stopped what she was doing. She had heard these words from Thomas, who had meant them entirely and quietly, the way a good man's love is quiet and reliable. She had heard them from Raymond, who had not meant them at all, which she understood later. She had not expected to hear them again, in this kitchen or any kitchen. She had managed her expectations very carefully on this point. She turned from the window and looked at Luke, and what she saw was the same thing she had been seeing for months. The man who fixed the fence before being asked, who cleared the debris dam, who handed her the canteen in the heat, who sat outside her walls without trying to breach them, and waited with a patience that was not a tactic but a character. Who was here, fully here on the terms she had named, without negotiation or erosion. "I know," she said, and then, because this was a man who deserved the full sentence, "I love you too. I have been moving toward that for a while, and I wanted to be certain before I said it." "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said, the most certain she had been of anything since she had decided this ranch was worth saving. He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and held her in the kitchen with the December light fading outside, and Grace felt the last of the great wall she had built come down, not with a crash, not with drama, but with the quiet exhale of a thing that has been standing against the wind for a long time and is finally permitted to rest. The new year arrived with a clarity that Grace took as confirmation. January in the territory was cold enough to make the mornings hard, and she and Luke rode the fence lines in coats, and the ranch hands wore more layers, and the cattle huddled at the eastern shelter, where the windbreak trees made the cold more bearable. The work was the same as always and more difficult, and she had never been happier to do it. In February, Luke asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He asked her in the kitchen in the morning with coffee on the table and the sunrise coming in through the east window, which she thought later was exactly right. Not a performance, not a stage, just the real daily territory of their lives. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "I want to build a life here with you, not because of the ranch, because of you. I want to marry you if you'll have me." Grace looked at his hand on hers and thought about every wall she had built and every brick she had laid and every cold morning she had stood on the far side of them, and convinced herself she was sufficient. She was sufficient. She still was. But there was a particular kind of richness on this side of the door that she had not known she was missing until this quiet, steady man had sat outside long enough to show her it was there. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married in March, in the community hall in Redemption Creek, on a day when the desert had managed one of its occasional performances of wildflowers, so the road into town was bordered with color. Judge Harlan performed the ceremony, Clara Briggs stood with Grace, and old Pete, who was walking well enough for short distances now, stood with Luke. Tamaz and Felix were in the front, and Ezra Fenn brought a cake that was not elegant but was very good. Grace wore the blue dress and her good boots and her dark hair loose for the first time anyone in Redemption Creek had ever seen it, which caused a small, pleasant sensation. Luke wore his one good jacket and a new hat he had bought for the occasion, and when she came to stand beside him, he looked at her the way he had looked at her at the autumn social, with the unguarded brightness that was his most honest face, and she felt it in every room of herself. The words were simple and meant completely. When Judge Harlan reached the part about through difficulty and against hardship, Grace looked at Luke and he looked at her, and they both knew exactly what that meant, and meant it in the specific, earned way that only comes to people who have actually been through the difficulty. Old Pete said afterward, to nobody in particular, "Well, it took long enough." And then corrected himself. No, it took exactly long enough. The spring of 1879 came to the Shepard Ranch, which Luke did not ask to rename and Grace did not change, because the name was her own with the renewed energy that follows a settling into. Tamaz took on more responsibilities as a foreman in practice, if not yet in title, directing Felix with the patient authority of a man born to it. And the ranch expanded its eastern grazing by 20 acres through a lease arrangement with the neighboring property whose owners had moved to California. The cattle herd grew to 70 head, which was the most it had been since Thomas's time, and the water management that Grace had refined over 4 hard years was better than it had ever been. Luke worked the ranch with the same quality of attention he had brought from the first day, except now it was his home in the full sense, and the work carried that extra dimension of investment. He and Grace developed the particular working partnership of two people who know each other well enough to anticipate and complement. She had the instinct for the cattle numbers and the market timing. He had a gift for the land and the physical problems of the property. And together they were significantly better than either had been alone, which Grace acknowledged freely and without it costing her anything, because it was simply true. She also acknowledged, in the privacy of the kitchen table conversations that had become the heartbeat of their days, that she had been wrong about what self-sufficiency had to mean. She had thought it meant needing nothing from anyone. She understood now that it meant bringing your whole self into a life and choosing, from that wholeness, who and what to let in. She had not needed Luke to survive. She had chosen him. There was a profound difference, and the difference was everything. In June of 1879, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge alone for 2 days, turning it over with the careful, serious attention she gave to any significant development. She had not thought she would have children again. She had lost a pregnancy in her first year with Thomas, early and quietly, and had grieved it and moved on, and had not, after that, allowed herself to hope in that direction. Raymond had not been a man she would have wanted to have children with, which was fortunate since he had not stayed long enough for the question to arise. But now she was 30 years old and healthy, and running a stronger ranch than she had ever run, with a man beside her who was steady and true and present, and the thing growing in her felt less like a surprise than like a confirmation. She told Luke on the 3rd evening, at the kitchen table, over coffee, which was where the important things happened between them. He went very still for a moment. Then he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something open and overwhelmed and deeply glad, all at once. "You're certain?" he asked. "I'm certain," she said. He reached across and took her hands in both of his and held them for a long, quiet moment. Then he brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was so different from his usual manner that it made her throat tight. How are you feeling about it?" He asked because he had learned to ask the real question. "Scared," she said honestly, "and glad." She paused, More glad than scared, which is new for me with most things. You won't do this alone, he said. I know, she said. And she did know. That was also new. She told Tomás and Felix and Pete on a Sunday morning, and each of them received the news in ways exactly consistent with their characters. Tomás nodded with solemn satisfaction. Felix whooped and then apologized for whooping. Pete's eyes went bright with the emotion of a man who has watched the people he cares for come through difficulty and arrive somewhere they deserve. Clara Briggs became Grace's most reliable companion through the months that followed, having had 3 children of her own, and being the kind of woman whose advice was practical and without unnecessary sentiment. Grace appreciated her deeply. The pregnancy was not easy in its middle months. The desert heat of another Arizona summer was not kind to a woman in her condition, and Grace battled the practical indignity of it with characteristic determination, modifying her work as necessary and accepting Luke's adjustments to the division of their labor with something that was still occasionally difficult for her, but was getting easier. She understood, with the same clear-eyed accounting she applied to everything, that accepting care from a person who offered it freely and without strings was not the same as needing to be managed. It was simply love, expressed in the practical language they both spoke most fluently. Luke, for his part, navigated this with exceptional judgment. He never overmanaged. He never made her feel restricted or diminished. He shifted work when it was necessary, asked before he decided, and when she insisted on doing a thing herself, he trusted her to know her own limits, which she did and which he respected. This was the partnership as it had always been, adapted to new circumstances. November of 1879 brought early cold and a sun. He was born on a Tuesday morning. Grace would always note that the important things in her life seemed to happen on Tuesdays, and she could not say if this was significant or simply the way memory arranges itself. In the bedroom of the main house with Clara Briggs and the doctor from Redemption Creek in attendance, while Luke sat outside the closed door with his hat in his hands and old Pete sat beside him, and neither of them said much of anything. When Clara opened the door and said, "Come in, she's asking for you," Luke stood and crossed the threshold and found Grace in the bed with a small, furious red face in the crook of her arm, both of them looking wrung out and entirely triumphant, and Luke sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife and was, for one of the very few times she had known him, without words. He found them. "He's something," he said. "He is," Grace agreed. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," she said, which was the truest thing she had said since yes. They named him James Thomas Hale, for Luke's father and Grace's first husband, which felt right in the way things feel right when they have been considered from every angle and still make sense. James Thomas Hale came into the world with dark hair and his mother's eyes and his father's quality of stillness even as an infant, which made old Pete say that the boy had come into the world with good manners and was already ahead of most men he'd known. The winter of 1879 rolled into 1880, with James growing from furious newborn into a baby of decided opinions, and Grace and Luke navigated the new complexity of parenthood with the same basic approach they applied to everything: attention, communication, adaptation. There were harder nights and there were extraordinary mornings, and there were days when Grace was so tired she could barely think. And on those days, Luke took the night duty without being asked, and came to the morning coffee slightly bleary but without complaint. And Grace loved him with the specific, fierce, domestic love that grows when you see a person show up completely in the unglamorous hours. Cordweb never came back. Word reached Redemption Creek in the spring of 1880 that he had been involved in a land dispute in New Mexico territory that had gone badly wrong, and that he had relocated further east under circumstances that suggested a significant reduction in both his resources and his ambitions. Grace filed this information and felt no particular emotion about it beyond satisfaction. Tomás was formally made foreman in February of 1880, with a title to match the work he had been doing for 2 years, and a wage increase that made Felix, who had witnessed Grace's way of doing things for long enough to trust it, nod with the satisfied air of a man working for someone worth working for. Grace paid fair, and she always had, which was known throughout the region, which meant that when she needed to hire a third hand in the spring, because the herd had grown again, now at 85 head, she had 3 good candidates in the first week. She hired a man named Samuel, who was in his 30s and had come from Georgia with a quiet sadness Grace recognized as grief's long signature, and who turned out to work with the clean-handed steadiness she had long since identified as the mark of a good hand. Within a month, he and Tamaz had established the kind of working rapport that made the ranch function better, and Felix had adopted him as an older brother without asking anyone's permission. By the summer of 1880, the Shepard Ranch, Grace's ranch, her name on it always, was the strongest it had been in its history. The cattle numbered 90, the fences were sound, the water management was better than any comparable operation in the county, and the ledgers were in the black. Grace kept the books herself, which she had always done and intended to keep doing. She sat on the porch one August evening, the chair beside her occupied by Luke, who had James on his knee, the baby now 9 months old and inclined to grab at hat brims and express strong opinions about most things, and looked out at the desert that had been her whole world for 7 years. The land was the same. The mountains were the same purple-blue on the horizon. The stars were arriving one by one in their habitual order. Everything else was different, in the best way that different can be. "What are you thinking?" Luke asked. "I'm thinking," she said, and looked at him, this man who had sat outside long enough to show her that the door existed, "that I was very sure I did not want this. This specifically," he said, gesturing vaguely at the baby and the ranch and the evening. "This specifically," she said, "all of it. And now," she looked at James, who had successfully removed Luke's hat and was examining it with the grave concentration of an engineer assessing a new mechanism. She looked at the land that was hers, and had always been hers, and was now theirs. She looked at Luke, who was watching her with the same patient, warm, undemanding regard he had brought to her fence line on a Tuesday in April more than 2 years ago. "Now," she said, "I think I am the most fortunate woman in the Arizona Territory." He smiled. "That's a very high bar given the competition." "I have always set high standards," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, full and easy, the kind that belongs to a man in his right place, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to lean, without losing herself in the leaning, just 2 solid people resting into each other at the end of a good day. James Hale dropped the hat in the dust, regarded this outcome with interest, and then looked at his parents with the direct, serious gaze of a child who was paying close attention to everything, which Grace thought was just right. She wanted him to see this not perfection, not a story with all its difficulties smoothed away, but 2 people who had chosen each other carefully and built something real on the choosing. She wanted him to understand that the strongest things are the ones you build with your eyes open, knowing what they cost and deciding they are worth it. She wanted him to see his mother as a woman who had built her walls for good reason and had not been asked to take them down, had been given instead the particular gift of someone who waited quietly enough and truly enough that she had taken them down herself, on her own terms, when she was ready. She thought, looking at the desert going dark, and her husband going soft-eyed over their son, and the ranch breathing around them in its evening rhythm, that the gift of choosing was everything. That being chosen, slowly and surely and without pressure, by someone who would have accepted the answer either way, was the only kind of choosing that had ever felt like freedom. The walls were gone. Not because the storm had stopped. The territory would always have its storms, its droughts, its hard men and hard seasons, and the plain, grinding difficulty of life in a place that did not offer comfort easily. The walls were gone because she had decided for the first time that the risk of the storm was worth the warmth of the light. She pressed her hand over Luke's where it rested on her shoulder. He turned his palm and held her hand. The stars came all the way out. James Thomas Hale made a noise of decisive opinion about something in the middle distance, and Grace and Luke both looked at him, and then at each other, and Grace felt the completeness of the thing, not a thing without difficulty ahead of it, not a thing sealed from the future's uncertainties, but a thing that was whole, and true, and entirely, irreversibly, worth every wall she had ever had to take down. In the years that followed, the Shepard Ranch kept its name and kept growing. A daughter came in 1882, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, whom they named Margaret Ellen Hale for Grace's mother, and for no one in particular, because the name simply suited her. And Margaret Hale was very much a person who suited herself. James grew into a serious, capable boy who was in the saddle before he was 5, and had his father's gift for the land and his mother's gift for the books, which Tamaz said with approval made him potentially the most dangerous rancher in the territory. Old Pete lived comfortably in the bunkhouse until 1883, when he moved to a small house in Redemption Creek that Grace and Luke quietly arranged for him, close enough to visit and far enough for the dignity of his own space. He came out for the major moments: cattle drives, holidays, the children's birthdays, and Grace rode to see him every 2 weeks with provisions, and the specific pleasure of someone who considers loyalty as permanent as deed. Tamaz married a woman from Tucson named Alina in 1881, who was intelligent and direct and ran Tamaz's personal affairs with the same efficient management that Tamaz ran the ranch, and they built a small house on the north edge of the Shepard property, which Grace arranged as part of the Foreman arrangement. It was the right thing and made good sense, and improved everyone's lives considerably. Felix eventually found his way to Prescott, where he married and started a small freight operation, and sent letters that arrived irregularly and were always cheerful and slightly breathless. Samuel stayed. He found his footing in the Arizona territory in the slow, deliberate way of a man growing into his right place, and over the years, his grief's long signature softened into something more like the background character of a person who has known loss and kept going, which Grace understood entirely and respected. By 1884, Grace was 34 and Luke was 37, and the ranch was 110 head strong, and the two of them had settled into the deep, complex, imperfect, extraordinary life of people who have been through enough to know what they have and keep choosing it. On a Tuesday evening, still Tuesdays, always Tuesdays for the important things, they sat on the porch with the desert doing its evening colors, and James, who was 4, asleep inside, and Margaret, who was 2, also asleep, having expressed 17 distinct opinions about this fact before finally succumbing. The porch held 2 chairs that had always been there, and had been replaced twice over the years, and would be replaced again, as the furniture of a life in use always needs to be. Grace held a cup of coffee and Luke held a cup of coffee, and the stars arrived in their order, and the land spread out before them in the way that land deeply spreads out, not as a view but as a presence, familiar and dear. "I was thinking," Luke said, "about April." "Which April?" "The first one, when I rode past the north fence and you were there with the pliers." She smiled. "You were very dusty. You were very ferocious. I was annoyed at a fence post." "You were magnificent," he said simply as a fact. She looked at him. "You didn't push," she said. "From the beginning you didn't push." "No, why not, truly? I've wondered sometimes if you were just patient by nature, or if it was a decision." He considered this for a moment, the way he always considered things before he spoke. "A little of both," he said. "I am patient by nature. But it was also you were very clear about what you were and about what you had been through and about what you needed, and I could see it." He paused. "Pushing would have been saying that what I wanted mattered more than what you needed, and that was never going to be true. What you needed mattered more." A pause. "It still does." Grace set down her coffee cup and looked at this man, this battered hat, patient, fence-fixing, canteen-extending, wall-respecting man who had ridden past her north fence in April of 1878, and had changed the trajectory of her life not by doing anything dramatic but by doing something far harder, which was showing up completely and consistently and asking nothing she was not ready to give. "Luke," she said. "Yes." I'm glad you stopped to ask for directions." He laughed the full, easy laugh that she loved. "So am I," he said. "Best wrong turn I ever made." She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together as they had sat so many evenings, the two chairs side by side on the porch of the Shepard Ranch, in the Arizona Territory, in the year of our Lord 1884, with the desert going quietly dark around them and the stars filling in the sky with their patient, permanent light. The walls were gone, not because the storms stopped coming, they never stopped coming. Not because the world became safe or easy, or without its cruelties and its losses and its hard seasons, but because Grace Shepard had looked at what she had built and looked at what was on the other side of it, and had decided deliberately and with her whole clear eyes open that the light was worth it, and Luke Hale had simply sat outside long enough for her to see it clearly, which was, she had come to understand, the greatest gift one person can give another, not the removal of their walls, but the patient, steady, loving presence that gives them reason to find the door themselves. She held his hand. He held hers. The night came on full and soft, and the ranch settled around them into its rightful quiet, and the story that had started with a fence post and a Tuesday and a man on a road asking the right direction had arrived at the only ending worth having, not a perfect life, but a true one, built by two people who had chosen each other with their whole hearts, on terms they both deserved. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.